2020 was a year etched into human history, not as a mere passing moment, but as a collective wound. Across the globe, billions awoke each day to uncertainty, loved ones separated by distance, fear lingering in every breath, and a growing ache for normalcy that seemed increasingly out of reach. Hospitals became battlegrounds, grocery stores, places of unease, streets that once buzzed with laughter and life were now hauntingly empty, as if the world itself had stopped to catch its breath. Yet, in the midst of this stillness, life quietly persisted, fragile, resilient, hopeful. People found ways to adapt, to survive, to love. For some, the isolation was unbearable, a suffocating reminder of what had been lost. For others, it became a mirror, reflecting who they truly were when the noise of the world was stripped away. And for two strangers in the heart of the pandemic, isolation became a bridge, connecting them in a way neither could have imagined. This is a story of love born not in ideal circumstances, but in the shadow of loss, a story of fleeting moments, tender connections, and a world fighting for its future. Elena and David did not meet under the glow of ordinary days. They met in the darkest of times, a nurse weighed down by the lives she couldn't save, and a photographer searching for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its soul. This isn't just a love story, it's a story of sacrifice, a story of fleeting moments that remind us of the fragility of human connection, and how, even in the face of insurmountable loss, love can find its way. But as the world crumbled around them, what began as a fragile bond faced a test that no heart could prepare for. In a world suffocating under the weight of uncertainty, two lives moved through the chaos, unaware of the threads quietly pulling them together. Elena, a nurse, was no stranger to sacrifice. Every day she entered the ICU, she carried the weight of her patients' lives and the whispers of those she couldn't save. For her, each breath behind a mask was a reminder of the fragile line between hope and despair. She was relentless, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because stepping away felt like betrayal to her patients, to herself, and to the family she had pushed to the margins of her life. For David, survival looked different. His camera became his compass, guiding him through a world that no longer made sense. Each click of the shutter was an attempt to freeze fleeting moments of humanity, the laughter of a child on a deserted street, the silent goodbyes exchanged through hospital windows, the weary eyes of a nurse who hadn't slept in days. But his lens couldn't capture the ache inside him, the void left by his mother's passing. In the quiet of his apartment, he searched for meaning in the chaos he documented, hoping that by giving others a voice, he might silence his own grief. It was at a relief center, amidst the hum of forklifts and the hurried footsteps of volunteers, that their paths crossed for the first time. Elena was in charge, her voice calm but firm as she directed the unloading of medical supplies. David, with his camera slung over his shoulder, approached her cautiously, asking for permission to take a few shots. She hesitated. Her time was precious, and her patience even more so. But something in his demeanor, and the way he carried himself, made her nod. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't here for spectacle. He was here for the story. Their first words were simple, practical. He asked for angles. She pointed out the scene. There was no spark, no grand revelation, just two people trying to do their jobs in a world that seemed to be falling apart. But over time, their conversations deepened. It started with a shared coffee break, 2 cups of lukewarm liquid sipped in silence until David broke it with a quiet observation. "It must feel like you're holding the world on your shoulders." She looked at him, startled. No one had asked her that. No one had dared to pull back the curtain of composure she wore like armor. And in that moment, something shifted. She didn't reply, but the silence spoke louder than words. In the days that followed, their connection grew in the spaces between their work. Late at night, when the relief center was quiet, they exchanged text messages. He sent her photos and posed, unfiltered moments that captured the essence of her humanity. She replied with glimpses of her own struggles, confessions typed out in the safety of a screen. Each message was a step closer, each conversation a thread weaving their lives together. David admired her resilience, the way she carried herself despite the burdens she bore. Elena, in turn, found solace in his honesty, his willingness to confront his own pain through his art. They weren't looking for love. Neither had time for it, nor the strength to open their hearts in a world that demanded so much. But love doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It sneaks in through the cracks, growing quietly until it's too big to ignore. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. They found joy in the little things: a shared joke, a candid photograph, a moment of stillness in a storm that never seemed to end. But life, as they would soon discover, doesn't grant happiness without a price. And in a world already brought to its knees, their love was about to face a test neither could have prepared for. In the midst of chaos, their connection became a lifeline, a thread of hope woven through countless moments of despair. Elena and David found comfort not in grand gestures, but in the quiet rituals that became their sanctuary. Late-night video calls, where David would hold his camera to the window, showing Elena the city lights as she sat in the dim glow of her break room, sipping stale coffee. One day he whispered in one of those calls, his voice barely audible over the hum of hospital monitors, "I'll take you up there. The view is incredible, like the whole city is breathing again." She smiled, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion the words couldn't hide. One day, she replied, holding on to the promise like a lifeboat in a storm. On her rare days off, Elena found small packages waiting at her doorstep, carefully wrapped boxes containing handwritten notes, a disposable camera, or her favorite snacks. Each delivery was a reminder that someone saw her, cared for her, even as the world seemed to demand all she had to give. For David, these gestures were his way of saying what he couldn't in words, that she mattered, that in the vast emptiness of his life, she had become his anchor. Their conversations drifted to dreams of a future beyond the pandemic. David spoke of opening a gallery to display the stories he captured, images of strength, grief, and survival. Elena admitted, almost shyly, that she wanted to go back to school, to study medicine and specialize in critical care. "It's funny," she said one night, her voice soft. "I never thought I'd find myself in a hospital, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else. It's like this is where I'm meant to be." David nodded, his hand lingering over his camera lens. "You're brave," he said simply, "braver than I'll ever be." But beneath their laughter and whispered dreams, the weight of reality pressed down on them, a shadow that neither could ignore for long. The first sign of trouble came in a phone call, David's voice hoarse, his breathing shallow. "It's nothing," he assured Elena, trying to mask the strain. Just a mild case. I'll rest, stay hydrated. I'll be fine. But Elena knew better. She heard the unspoken fear in his words, the tension he tried to hide. She wanted to be there, to hold his hand and tell him he wasn't alone. But the distance between them was more than physical. For 2 weeks, David isolated himself in his apartment, the silence punctuated by his labored breaths and the constant ping of Elena's texts. She sent him instructions, reminders to check his oxygen levels, and messages filled with cautious optimism. But her own world was unraveling. The ICU was overflowing, each bed a reminder of how fragile life had become. One night, after losing a young mother whose husband stood weeping in the corridor, Elena locked herself in the supply closet and cried for the first time in months. She felt the weight of every failure, every life that slipped through her fingers. How do you keep going? She asked David during a late-night call, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, deliberate. You just do, he said, because stopping isn't an option. The lockdowns stretched on, each day blurring into the next. The distance between them felt insurmountable. Even as their bond grew stronger, they clung to each other through the screens, but both knew it wasn't enough. Elena's shifts grew longer, her body worn thin by exhaustion. David, though recovering, grew quieter, his messages shorter, as if the weight of the world had drained his energy. And then, without warning, the messages stopped. Elena's phone buzzed in the middle of her shift. A number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the words hit her like a blow. David Peterson has been admitted. COVID unit, room 207. She froze, the clipboard in her hand slipping to the floor. It felt impossible, like a cruel joke. But when she entered the ward, there he was, a shell of the man she had come to know. His face was pale, his breathing labored, his once steady hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the hospital bed. She wanted to rush to him, to hold him, but the barriers between them were unyielding. Masks, gloves, gowns, layers of protection that felt more like prison walls. She stood at the doorway, her heart breaking as she watched him struggle. His eyes flickered open, meeting hers for a fleeting moment. A weak smile formed on his lips. I didn't want you to see me like this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped closer, her voice shaking. You don't get to decide that. I'm here, David. I'm not going anywhere. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had seen this before, the slow unraveling, the body's desperate fight against an enemy couldn't defeat. She had watched patients cling to life only to slip away, and now she was watching it happen to the person who had become her reason to keep going. Asterisk. The days stretched into a blur of clinical monotony and emotional chaos. Elena watched over David from afar, unable to provide the comfort she so desperately wanted to give. As a nurse, she knew the symptoms, the signs that hope was slipping through her fingers. But as a woman in love, she refused to believe them. She clung to every flicker of progress, every slight improvement, willing herself to see a future that was quickly fading from view. Then came the night she feared most. The monitors screamed their alarm, a shrill, unrelenting cry that echoed in the sterile room. Elena rushed to his side, her colleagues gathering around with the precision of a team accustomed to emergencies. But this was no ordinary case. This was David, her David. She called his name, her voice muffled by the layers of her mask, her hands trembling as they hovered above him, aching to hold, but knowing they couldn't. "Stay with me," she whispered, as if her words alone could anchor him to this world. The team worked tirelessly, their voices a chorus of medical jargon, but Elena heard none of it. All she could see was David, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, and then nothing. Time seemed to halt. The machines fell silent, the room filled with an unbearable stillness. Elena felt the weight of her grief settle over her like a tidal wave, crushing and relentless. The world she had fought so hard to keep together had finally crumbled, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of a love that was never meant to last. After the room was cleared and the machines powered down, one of the attending nurses handed her a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable David's. She stared at it, her vision blurred with tears, before finally tearing it open with shaking hands. The note was brief, written in the uneven scrawl of a man who knew his time was running out. "Elena, you gave me hope in a time when hope seemed impossible. Even if we don't have forever, you were my always. Thank you for letting me love you, even for a little while." David. The words shattered her in ways she didn't think possible. She sank to the floor, clutching the paper to her chest as sobs racked her body. In that moment, the weight of the pandemic, the lives lost, the love stolen, the dreams deferred became too much to bear. Yet, even in her despair, she felt a flicker of something else, gratitude for the time they had shared, for the moments of joy amidst the pain, for a love that, however brief, had changed her forever. The days that followed were a haze of grief and routine. Elena returned to work, throwing herself into her duties with a renewed intensity. It was easier to stay busy, to drown her sorrow in the relentless demands of the ICU, and to confront the emptiness David had left behind. But in the quiet hours, when the hospital corridors fell silent, she found herself drawn to the photographs he had sent her. They were unlike anything she had seen before, raw and filtered glimpses into the humanity of the pandemic. There was the elderly couple holding hands through a plastic barrier, their faces etched with both fear and love. The child blowing kisses to a nurse in full PPE. The exhausted doctor leaning against a wall, her head bowed in quiet resignation. Each image told a story, and together they painted a picture of resilience, of a world clinging to hope even as it faced unimaginable loss. Elena began to share the photographs, first with her colleagues, then with the families of the patients who had become unwilling subjects in David's lens. The images brought comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was beauty to be found. Soon, David's work gained attention beyond the hospital walls. His photographs were published, exhibited, and celebrated as a testament to the human spirit in the face of adversity. One evening, standing in a small gallery that had dedicated an entire exhibit to David's work, Elena felt the weight of her grief lift, if only slightly. She stood before an image she had never seen before, a candid shot of her, sitting at her desk, her head resting in her hands. The caption read, "The Quiet Heroes." She smiled through her tears, hearing his voice in her mind as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You're braver than I'll ever be." And in that moment, she realized that David's legacy wasn't just in the photographs he left behind, but in the lives he had touched, the hearts he had healed, and the love he had given so freely, even when the world gave him every reason to close himself off. As she left the gallery that night, the city lights reflected in her eyes. She whispered a silent promise. "Thank you, David, for everything. I'll keep going for you." And with that, she stepped into the night, carrying his memory with her, a beacon of light in a world that was slowly learning to heal. In the weeks that followed, Elena found herself drawn to the photographs again and again. Each image carried David's force, his perspective, his belief in the enduring resilience of the human spirit. But they weren't just pictures, they were stories. Fragments of lives intertwined with hers and his, reflections of the pain, love, and perseverance that defined the pandemic. One night, as she sat surrounded by the prints, an idea began to take shape. What if these photographs could do more? What if David's work could become a beacon for others, a way to honor the sacrifices of frontline workers, the survivors who carried their scars, and the families who mourned? Elena reached out to local organizations, to galleries, to anyone who would listen. She poured her heart into the project, weaving together David's images with testimonials from healthcare workers, patients, and families. She titled it, "Through Their Eyes: Stories of Love and Loss in the Pandemic." The first exhibition was held in a modest community center, but word spread quickly. People came not just to see the photographs, but to share their own stories. A mother whose child survived weeks on a ventilator, a delivery driver who became a lifeline for his neighborhood, a young couple who married in an empty church, their vows exchanged over FaceTime with their families watching from afar. Elena stood at the back of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw tears, laughter, quiet moments of reflection. This was what David had captured life in all its raw and messy beauty. And as she watched, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. In the closing moments of the exhibit, Elena stepped forward to address the audience. Her voice trembled at first, but she steadied herself, her words gaining strength. "This story," she began, "is not just about love loss. It's about the strength to keep loving, even when the world is broken. It's about remembering that, even in our darkest moments, we are not alone." Her gaze swept the room, her heart full of gratitude for the faces before her. David believed in the power of stories to heal, to connect us, to remind us of our humanity. I hope that as you leave here tonight, you carry his message with you, that no matter how fragile life may seem, love, true, unwavering love, has the power to endure. As the exhibit grew, so did its impact. Elena encouraged attendees to share their own pandemic experiences, inviting them to add their voices to a growing archive of resilience. Online, the project took on a life of its own. People from all over the world contributed their stories, small acts of kindness, moments of unbearable loss, unexpected triumphs. In a final voiceover, Elena spoke directly to the camera, her words a call to the audience. "The pandemic took so much from us," she said softly, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and hope. "But it also reminded us of what truly matters: connection, compassion, and the courage to keep moving forward. So I ask you this: what would you do differently if you knew tomorrow wasn't guaranteed? Who would you hold a little closer? What words would you say today knowing they might to your last share your story. Let it be a part of this legacy, a testament to the fact that, even in the face of unimaginable loss, we found ways to endure, to love, to hope. You gave me hope in a time when hope seemed impossible. Even if we don't have forever, you were my always.